Two brothers bought an abandoned island for pennies. They thought they had found the perfect place for a new life. But beneath the old fisherman's hut lay a secret that no one was supposed to see. When they opened the hidden passageway and saw what was inside, their world was turned upside down forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching this video from. The decision to buy the island was not made in a single moment of rash excitement, nor was it the result of careful, calculated planning. It grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, out of the long, weary days the brothers had spent in the city. Days filled with noise, smoke, and an endless routine that pressed down on them like a heavy hand. For years they had spoken in fragments and half-dreams about leaving it all behind, of finding a place where the horizon stretched wide and life was reduced to its essentials. Yet it had always seemed like a fantasy, a story they told each other late at night when the walls of their cramped apartment felt as though they were pressing inward. Michael, the elder by only a few minutes but always the more measured of the two, was the first to notice the advertisement. It was buried on a real estate website among listings for old sheds, scraps of farmland, and forgotten warehouses. A small island, no more than a dot on the map, sat for sale at a price so low it almost seemed a trick. He read the description twice before calling Thomas to his side. The words were sparse: abandoned property, derelict fisherman's hut, no utilities, sold as is. Most people would scroll past such a thing, but in their restless minds it glowed like an invitation. Thomas, as always, was quicker to leap. His imagination filled instantly with images: a cabin by the sea, nets drying in the salt air, mornings spent casting lines into calm water, and nights lit only by the stars. Where Michael hesitated, wondering about legal rights, flood levels, and the cost of repairs, Thomas only grinned and said this was the kind of opportunity that never came twice. Their savings were not large, but they were enough, and the idea of owning something so absolute as an island tugged at them with irresistible force. After only a week of debate, their decision was sealed. Papers were signed, money transferred, and with a few swift strokes of bureaucracy, the land was theirs. The day they set out to see it for the first time was marked by a heavy gray sky. The sea lay before them like a sheet of beaten metal, reflecting the dull light with a chill that made Michael uneasy. They had hired a fisherman from the nearest coastal village to ferry them across, a man with skin as weathered as the planks of his boat. He said little, though once or twice his eyes flicked to them with something like pity or disbelief. When Thomas mentioned cheerfully that they had just bought the island, the man spat into the water and muttered that no one else had ever wanted it. He gave no explanation, and neither brother pressed for one. The boat ride was longer than they had expected. The coastline fell away behind them, the village shrinking into a smear of gray against the cliffs, until there was only the sound of the motor and the hiss of water against the hull. For long stretches, neither of them spoke. Michael kept glancing at the horizon, his brow furrowed, while Thomas sat forward as if by leaning he could reach the future faster. When at last the island came into view, it was little more than a lump of green and brown, rising from the waves with an air of neglect. As they drew nearer, the details sharpened. The shoreline was a jagged line of rocks, broken only by a narrow strip of shingle that could barely be called a beach. Behind it rose a slope covered with stubborn bushes and grass bent low by the wind. At the crest stood the hut they had read about, its roof caved in on one side, the timbers blackened with age and salt. The remains of what had once been a small pier jutted into the water like a broken rib, its planks missing, its posts slick with seaweed. Thomas's grin faltered for the first time, but only briefly. "It just needs work," he said, more to himself than to Michael. His brother said nothing. The boatman maneuvered them close to the remains of the pier, and they scrambled onto the slippery rocks, their boots crunching on the wet shingle. The man refused to come further than necessary. He muttered that he would return in a week to check on them if they needed supplies, then steered his boat away without looking back. The sound of the motor faded quickly, leaving the brothers standing in silence, alone with their purchase. The hut looked worse up close. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, half off its frame. One window was broken entirely, the other so caked with grime it was almost opaque. The roof sagged inward where storms had pried away shingles, leaving the interior exposed to years of rain. When Thomas pushed the door open, it groaned in protest, releasing a gust of air that smelled of rot and seaweed. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, old fishing nets, shattered glass, splinters of wood, and the skeletal remains of furniture. A rusted stove leaned against one wall, its pipe bent and broken. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to their clothes as they stepped inside. Michael ran his hand over the doorframe, feeling the rough grain of wood softened by decades of neglect. He shook his head slowly. "It will take more than work," he murmured, though Thomas pretended not to hear. Instead, Thomas strode to the center of the room, kicking aside a broken crate, and spread his arms wide as though to claim it all. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Our place. No bosses, no factories, no noise. Just this. Cheery." Yet even as he spoke, Michael's eyes lingered on the sagging ceiling and the weeds that crept through cracks in the floorboards. He felt a prickling unease that had nothing to do with the smell of mildew. There was a silence to the island, a silence different from the peace they had longed for. It was heavy, expectant, as though the place itself were waiting for them to prove they belonged. The first day passed in laborious exploration. They walked the perimeter of the island, boots crunching on rock and gravel, pushing through tangles of brush. The land was no larger than a handful of fields, with no sign of fresh water except the rain that pooled in shallow depressions. Birds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and distant. Aside from that, there was little life. The ground was uneven, scattered with boulders, and in places the cliffs dropped sheer into the sea. The only structure was the hut. The rest of the island lay untouched, as if it had been forgotten by the world. By evening they returned to the hut, carrying driftwood for a fire. The setting sun painted the sea in streaks of red and gold, but the beauty did little to lift Michael's unease. They cleared a patch of floor, set their gear down, and lit a small flame in the rusted stove. The smoke curled sluggishly upward before escaping through the broken pipe. They ate in silence, listening to the waves crashing against the rocks below. The wind whistled through the broken window, carrying with it the salt and chill of the sea. As the light faded, shadows lengthened across the hut's ruined interior. Thomas lay back on his bedroll, staring up at the dark beams, already lost in dreams of what the island could become. Michael sat upright, his arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the doorway where the last strip of daylight clung. He could not shake the sense that the place was more than it seemed, that beneath the layers of decay lay a story waiting to be uncovered. That night, as the waves pounded ceaselessly against the rocks and the wind rattled the timbers, the brothers slept uneasily. The island had accepted them, but not with warmth. It had taken them in with silence, with secrets buried beneath its soil and stone. They did not yet know it, but their purchase had bound them to a past far larger and heavier than the price they had paid. Their adventure had begun not with the dreams they carried, but with the mysteries that waited patiently in the dark corners of their new home. The night passed heavily, filled with the sound of waves hammering the rocks below and the whisper of wind that slid through the cracks of the ruined hut. Michael awoke several times, uneasy on the hard floor, while Thomas slept as though the exhaustion of the day had buried him in dreams. When morning finally came, the air inside was damp and smelled of salt and rotting wood. They rose stiffly, shook the sand from their clothes, and stepped outside into the pale light. The island looked no more welcoming than it had the evening before. The sea stretched endless and gray, and gulls wheeled overhead with shrill cries that echoed against the cliffs. Breakfast was meager bread and cheese eaten in silence while they sat on the crumbling steps of the hut. Thomas, as always, was the first to shake off the weight of fatigue. He pushed to his feet, clapped his hands together, and declared that the place needed to be cleared out. Michael followed reluctantly, though his eyes remained cautious, scanning the hut as though expecting it to reveal more flaws with every step. Together they re-entered the building and set to work, shoving aside piles of debris, broken nets, and fragments of furniture too rotted to serve any use. Dust rose thickly into the air, swirling in shafts of light that pierced the broken window. It was while moving a heap of splintered planks in the corner that Thomas noticed something unusual. The floor beneath looked uneven, a patch of stone set awkwardly among the warped boards. He tapped it with his boot and heard a sound different from the dull thud of wood. It was a hollow note, muffled yet distinct, as though the ground itself concealed something beneath. He crouched and brushed away the debris with his hands, revealing a large slab of stone, rectangular and set firmly into the earth. Michael joined him, frowning, and together they pried away the last of the dirt. The slab bore the marks of age, its surface rough and darkened with patches of lichen, but at one edge was a crude iron ring fixed into the rock. For a long moment neither spoke. The hut had seemed nothing but ruin, yet here was something deliberate, something crafted with purpose. Thomas's eyes gleamed with excitement, while Michael's narrowed with suspicion. They both crouched lower, gripping the iron ring. It resisted at first as though it had not been moved in decades, but with effort the slab began to shift. Dust and dirt crumbled from the edges, and a cold breath of air rose from the gap below. Slowly, with a groan of stone against stone, the slab tilted back, exposing a dark opening in the ground. The air that escaped was damp and smelled of earth and mildew. Michael drew back, covering his nose, while Thomas leaned eagerly over the edge. The faint outline of steps descended into the darkness, carved roughly from stone and worn by time. They led down into a passage too black for the eye to penetrate. Thomas grabbed the lantern they had brought from their supplies, lit it, and lowered it into the opening. The flickering light spilled downward, illuminating walls slick with moisture and steps that seemed to vanish into shadow. Michael hesitated, his stomach tight with unease. The idea of crawling into a hole beneath a ruin on a deserted island filled him with dread. But Thomas was already setting one foot on the first step, the lantern in his hand casting trembling light across the stone. He looked back only once, his face flushed with a thrill of discovery, before descending. With a resigned breath, Michael followed, gripping the edges of the opening as he lowered himself onto the staircase. The slab of stone loomed above them, framing the square of daylight that shrank with every step. The descent was slow and cautious. The steps were slick, and the ceiling hung low in places, forcing them to hunch. The sound of their boots echoed strangely, bouncing back from unseen angles. Drops of water fell intermittently from the stone, splashing against the floor with a hollow plink. The air grew colder the deeper they went, until Michael felt the chill seeping through his jacket. At last the staircase widened and opened into a larger chamber. The lantern's light revealed the interior of a cave. It was irregular in shape, the ceiling arched high in some places and pressed low in others. The walls glistened with moisture, and stalactites hung like jagged teeth above them. The ground was uneven, strewn with rocks and debris, but here and there were unmistakable signs of human presence. Against one wall stood the remnants of wooden crates, collapsed under their own weight, their boards warped and split with rot. Nearby lay a rusted metal barrel, its side split open, and beside it a heap of broken glass bottles. Thomas lifted the lantern higher, and the light slid over markings on the stone walls. They were not carvings of artistry, but rough scratches, perhaps made with a knife or chisel. Lines and initials, crude shapes, and the faint outline of what might have been symbols long eroded by dampness. In the center of the floor lay the remains of an old fire, a circle of blackened stone surrounding a bed of ash, so ancient it disintegrated when Michael touched it with his boot. This was no accident, Michael thought silently as he surveyed the scene. The cave had been used, lived in perhaps, by men who had sought shelter here long before the brothers set foot on the island. The crates and barrels, the scorched stones, and the markings all spoke of occupation. The hut above had been only a shell, a disguise, while the true activity had taken place beneath the ground. They moved deeper into the chamber, the lantern's glow pushing back the darkness in fragile circles. In one corner, half buried under rubble, stood a chest bound with iron bands. The wood was swollen with age, but the shape was unmistakable, a container built to endure. Thomas rushed toward it, pulling away stones and dirt with frantic energy. The chest was heavy, its lid cracked but still closed, as though it had waited decades for someone to find it. Michael approached more slowly, his eyes scanning the rest of the cave, wary of what else might lie hidden. The chest was not the only relic. Along another wall, 3 more crates leaned in a precarious pile, their sides split open to reveal scraps of cloth, rusted tools, and fragments of rope. A broken lantern lay among them, its glass shattered, its metal corroded. Scattered across the floor were small objects: a boot sole hardened with age, a clay pipe, a rusted knife whose handle had long since rotted away. Every detail whispered of men who had worked, eaten, and slept here, their presence lingering in the debris. Thomas knelt by the chest and ran his hand over the rough surface. "We've found something," his eyes seemed to say, though he spoke no words. Michael stood beside him, the lantern held steady, and together they lifted the lid. The hinges groaned, the wood cracked, and the smell of mold and decay rose thickly into the air. Inside, beneath a blanket of dust, lay bundles of papers tied with string. The edges were yellowed, curling with age, yet the ink was still visible in places. Beneath them, faintly gleaming in the lantern light, lay the corners of folded maps, their surfaces brittle but intact. Michael reached in carefully, lifting the top bundle. The paper crumbled slightly in his hands, but enough remained to reveal writing. The script was faded, the words cramped, but they were legible. Numbers, names, and dates covered the pages, along with notes written in hurried strokes. He turned another sheet and saw sketches of coastlines, marked with crosses and arrows. The reality settled heavily upon him. This was a record of something hidden, something never meant to be left behind. Thomas's excitement only grew. He sifted through the contents with trembling hands, pulling free the maps and spreading them across the chest's rim. Lines traced the outlines of bays and inlets, with certain points circled or underlined. Some notes were written in English, others in languages neither of them understood. It was clear that whoever had used this place had dealt with men from across the sea, trading and recording their work with meticulous care. As the lantern flickered, throwing long shadows against the cave walls, the brothers realized the truth of what they had stumbled upon. The island was no simple refuge for a lone fisherman, nor a worthless patch of land abandoned to the sea. It had been a hideout, a base carved into stone, where men had lived and worked in secrecy. The hut above had been nothing more than a disguise, while the heart of the island beat here, underground. Michael set the papers back into the chest and closed the lid, his brow furrowed in thought. The discovery stirred something uneasy in him. Secrets of this weight were rarely without consequence. But Thomas's face glowed with exhilaration, his mind already racing ahead to the possibilities. They had bought the island for almost nothing, and now it had revealed itself to hold far more than either had imagined. They stood in the flickering light, surrounded by the relics of another age, and felt the first tremors of the path they had begun to walk. The cave had opened its mouth to them, not in hostility, but in silence, as if to say that its secrets were now theirs to bear. Above them, the waves crashed endlessly against the shore, but here, beneath stone and earth, the air was still, waiting. The air inside the cave clung to their skin with a damp heaviness that made every breath feel labored, but the weight of discovery drove the brothers deeper into the chamber. The first chest had revealed its bundles of papers and maps, but the shadows beyond hinted that it was only the beginning. Their lantern flickered as if unwilling to light the whole truth at once, casting trembling arcs across stone and wood, revealing objects little by little. The sense of having trespassed into a forgotten world grew stronger with each step, and though Thomas carried himself with unrestrained excitement, Michael felt a gnawing wariness that anchored every movement of his hands and feet. They moved along the wall, the lantern's glow sliding over rough stone, until they reached the precarious pile of crates they had glimpsed earlier. The wood had warped so badly that the boards no longer fit together, and when Thomas touched one with the toe of his boot, it collapsed with a groan, spilling its contents onto the dirt. Rusted nails clattered across the floor, followed by a cascade of tattered cloth, its original color lost to mold and age. Beneath the cloth lay a scattering of tools, their blades eaten through with rust, their handles reduced to brittle fragments. Michael bent to lift a small hammer, its head almost fused to the rotted wood. The object crumbled in his hands, leaving only a streak of reddish dust across his palm. Thomas, undeterred, pulled open another crate. This one broke more reluctantly, its boards splitting with a sharp crack that echoed off the cave walls. Inside was a jumble of glass bottles, some intact but clouded with residue, others shattered into jagged pieces. The labels, if they had ever existed, were long gone, but the smell that rose from the shards was faintly sour, carrying with it the ghost of liquor that had once been sealed inside. He lifted one of the unbroken bottles, tilting it toward the lantern. A thin film of liquid clung stubbornly to the bottom, catching the light in dull glimmers. It was unmistakable. These were remnants of alcohol, perhaps smuggled during a time when such goods were worth more than gold in the right markets. The discovery seemed to animate Thomas further. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling one after the other as he imagined men carrying these crates into the cave, under cover of night, their boats sliding silently into the hidden cove, their hands unloading the precious cargo. He saw in his mind's eye the laughter and voices that must once have filled this place, the satisfaction of men who had beaten the law by using the island as their shield. Michael listened, but said little. His thoughts turned instead to the dangers those men must have faced, the risk of betrayal or capture, and the kind of desperation that drove them to carve out a life in darkness. They pressed onward, the lantern bobbing as they picked their way over the uneven ground. At the far end of the chamber, partly hidden behind a protrusion of rock, stood another chest. Unlike the first, this one remained intact, its lid sealed shut by a lock so corroded it seemed more like a lump of iron than a mechanism. Thomas crouched immediately, testing the lock with his fingers, but it held fast. He grinned despite the resistance, his eyes alight with challenge. Michael sighed and set the lantern on a flat stone, searching the ground until he found a piece of iron rod left among the debris. With patient force, he wedged it into the lock and twisted. The metal protested, squealing in the silence, until with a sudden snap the lock gave way, fragments scattering to the ground. The chest opened with a groan, its hinges stiff with age. Inside lay a far more organized collection than the crates had offered. Bundles of papers stacked carefully, their edges curled but still holding form, were tied with faded string. Michael lifted one bundle gingerly and brushed away a film of dust. He could make out names scrawled across the top sheets, followed by rows of numbers and short notes. Some appeared to be inventories lists of barrels, crates, and quantities that hinted at shipments far larger than what remained in the cave. Others seemed to be ledgers of payment, marked with initials instead of full names, as though secrecy had been vital even on paper. Underneath the papers lay rolled maps, their parchment brittle and yellowed. Thomas unrolled one slowly, weighing down the corners with stones. The lines revealed a stretch of coastline familiar to both of them, though marked in ways they had never seen on any ordinary map. Certain coves were circled in ink, small symbols drawn beside them, anchors, crosses, or hastily scratched notes. Narrow channels between rocks were labeled with arrows, suggesting secret routes known only to those who had risked them. The brothers bent close, their lantern light spilling across the parchment, and realized that they were looking at a guide for smuggling, a record of where to land, where to hide, and how to evade notice. Beneath the maps rested a handful of smaller objects. A compass, its glass cracked, but the needle still faintly twitching toward north, lay in a corner. Beside it, a pocket knife with a bone handle, rust having eaten away most of its blade. A pouch, stiff with age, held coins from different countries, their surfaces dulled but the markings still distinct enough to suggest that the men who had worked here dealt far beyond their own shores. Michael picked up one of the coins, turning it in his hand, and felt again that uneasy weight pressing on his chest. This was not simply the relic of a few fishermen trying to make ends meet. This was evidence of a network, a trade that stretched across seas, hidden in the shadows of law and order. Thomas laughed aloud, exhilarated by the thought. To him, the chest was a treasure trove, not of gold or jewels, but of proof that their island had once mattered. It was not a forgotten scrap of land sold cheaply to fools, but a place with history, a stage for secret acts that had left behind more than ruins. His voice echoed as he spoke of possibilities, of how the island could be transformed into a story to attract visitors, perhaps even scholars. Michael listened, but kept his eyes on the chest. His mind lingered not on opportunities, but on the men who had filled these ledgers with numbers and maps. He pictured them hunched over the same papers, by the same flickering lamplight, whispering names and codes as they plotted their movements. The thought filled him with both awe and unease. They spent hours sifting through the contents, spreading papers across the dirt floor, laying out the maps side by side. The story of the cave began to take shape in fragments. One ledger hinted at a shipment of liquor arriving by sea in the early years of the 20th century, at the height of prohibition laws elsewhere. Another noted a payment made in foreign currency, the initials of the payer scrawled hurriedly in the margin. A map marked a route that led not only to their island, but to another further along the coast, suggesting a chain of hidden outposts. Piece by piece, the brothers were stitching together a history that had been buried, one that no official record would ever admit. At times, Thomas would rise, pacing the cave with a lantern, his imagination racing ahead of the evidence. He spoke of men carrying crates under cover of night, of ships unloading cargo in silence, of lanterns glowing faintly against the Black Sea as they disappeared into the cove. He described laughter and danger, fortunes made and lost, the thrill of evading patrols. Michael remained seated by the chest, his hands steady on the papers. He read quietly, absorbing details, noting patterns. Where Thomas sought adventure, Michael saw risk, the desperation of men forced to live outside the law, the shadows that haunted every transaction. As the hours wore on, fatigue crept into their limbs. Dust clung to their skin, and their throats grew dry in the damp air. At last, they gathered the papers back into the chest, careful to preserve their fragile edges, and closed the lid. The lantern light had grown weaker, its fuel running low, and the shadows pressed closer around them. Together, they retraced their steps to the staircase, carrying the weight of discovery not in their arms but in their minds. When they emerged into the dimming daylight of the hut, both paused to breathe deeply of the sea air. The sky was streaked with late afternoon colors, the horizon glowing faintly as the sun dipped lower. Thomas wiped the sweat and dust from his face, his grin undimmed, and declared that they had uncovered something extraordinary. Michael said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence of the island seemed heavier now, as though it had acknowledged their intrusion and demanded that they continue. The hut, once a ruin of little value, had transformed in their eyes. It was no longer just a broken shell on a forgotten island, but a gateway, a mask that hid an entire history beneath it. As they sat that evening by the stove, feeding it with driftwood, the papers and maps lay beside them, their edges curling in the heat. The flames flickered across their faces, highlighting the contrast between Thomas's restless energy and Michael's thoughtful reserve. They had found more than relics of smugglers. They had found the first pieces of a story that threatened to pull them deeper, a story written in ledgers, maps, and shadows that refused to remain buried. That night, sleep came slowly. The wind rattled the broken window, and the sea's endless voice echoed against the rocks. Thomas dreamed of adventure and fortune, while Michael lay awake, the images of the cave replaying in his mind. He thought of the initials scrawled in margins, of the coins that had crossed oceans, of the men whose laughter might once have filled the chamber. And he wondered, with a heaviness he could not shake, what other secrets the island still held. Morning came slowly, the light creeping across the sea in pale ribbons that spilled onto the rocks of the island. The brothers rose stiff and sore, their bodies still heavy with the dust and dampness of the cave, yet their minds alive with the discoveries of the day before. The chest of maps and ledgers lay between them, where they had placed it near the stove, its presence filling the ruined hut with a sense of weight that went far beyond the damp wood and sagging roof. Neither spoke much during their breakfast, for both were lost in thought, but their silence was filled with different currents. Thomas's eyes gleamed with restless hunger as he traced the possibilities the island promised, while Michael's gaze was distant, drawn to the horizon, burdened by the questions that clung to every fragile sheet of paper they had uncovered. It was Thomas who insisted they return to the cave at once, convinced that the place held more than the crates and chests already revealed. Michael agreed, though less out of eagerness than out of the conviction that leaving the work half-finished would gnaw at him worse than the damp chill of the island. They descended once more through the stone stair, the lantern's light swinging as their boots echoed in the narrow passage. The chamber below seemed changed by their prior visit. as though the mere act of opening the chest had stirred something in the air. Dust swirled more thickly in the lantern's glow, and the shadows seemed to gather more tightly in the corners. They set about exploring with greater care than before, moving along the irregular walls and prodding at the ground where rocks lay piled unnaturally. It was near the far end of the chamber, where a jagged spur of stone jutted from the wall, that Thomas noticed a narrow opening partly concealed by rubble. At first it looked no more than a crack in the rock, but as they pushed aside stones and debris, it widened, revealing a passage barely tall enough for them to stoop through. The air that issued from it was colder still, tinged with the sharp scent of salt. Lantern in hand, Thomas pressed forward, his shoulders scraping against the damp walls. Michael followed, the close space tightening around him like a fist. The passage twisted, the floor sloping downward, and soon the sound of dripping water grew louder, echoing off unseen surfaces. At last the tunnel opened, and they found themselves standing at the edge of another chamber, this one vast and resonant. The lantern's light reached only so far, but beyond its glow they could hear the unmistakable hiss of the sea. They stepped forward, their boots crunching on gravel. The ceiling rose high above them, vanishing into darkness, and the air carried a steady breath of brine. As Thomas swung the lantern in an arc, its glow revealed what lay beyond. The chamber opened into a cove, hidden entirely within the embrace of the island. The water lapped quietly against a narrow shore of pebbles, its surface smoother than the restless waves outside. Here, sheltered by stone on all sides, the sea was calm, as though the world had forgotten to disturb it. The brothers stood in silence, awed by the perfection of the place. The entrance to the cove was narrow, a slit of blue light where the sea pressed inward, invisible from the outside world. Any ship that approached would see only sheer cliffs, yet those who knew the way could slip through and find safety in this secret harbor. Thomas's grin spread slowly, his imagination alive with images of boats gliding in at night, their sails dark against the stars, their cargo unloaded by men who whispered orders and heaved crates ashore. Evidence of such activity lay scattered about, though worn by time. On the gravel shore rested the remains of small boats, their frames collapsed, their planks softened by decades of salt and damp. Iron chains lay half buried in the stones, their links fused together by rust. Wooden posts, once driven deep into the ground to tether vessels, now leaned at crooked angles, their surfaces worn smooth by years of tide and weather. In the shadows further down the shore, a heap of broken barrels stood like the skeleton of commerce long dead, their staves warped, their iron hoops buckled. Michael knelt beside one of the posts and ran his fingers over the grain, marveling at how long it had endured. His mind filled with the thought of countless nights when men had stood in this very place, tying their boats, unloading goods, moving with speed and precision. He could almost hear the quiet splash of oars, the muted thud of crates set on the shore, the murmur of voices carried carefully so as not to echo beyond the cavern walls. Thomas ventured further along the shore, his lantern casting restless circles of light that revealed more remnants of the past. A rusted lantern frame, its glass long shattered, lay toppled among the stones. A coil of rope, stiff and blackened, clung stubbornly together though its fibers had fused with rot. He lifted it with both hands and it broke apart with a brittle crack, scattering fragments across the gravel. Near the wall of the cavern, he discovered a cluster of clay jars, their surfaces chipped, but some still intact. Half buried in sand. He lifted one gingerly, feeling its weight. When he tilted it, a faint rattle came from inside, the sound of something hardened and dry. This was no mere hiding place, Michael murmured, almost to himself as he watched his brother move through the relics. It was a port, and indeed it was. The cove had been shaped by nature into a perfect refuge, hidden from the eyes of law and traveler alike. But the marks of men's hands, the posts, the barrels, the boats, all showed how fully it had been claimed for human purpose. As they explored deeper into the cove, they found a smaller tunnel branching off from the main chamber, leading into a narrow alcove carved partly by the sea and partly by human effort. Here, tucked against the wall, were the remnants of storage, a series of shelves hammered crudely into stone, still bearing scraps of cloth and bits of rope. Among them lay a rusted tool, a pickaxe with its handle splintered, and the fragment of a wooden crate stamped with letters faded beyond recognition. Thomas held the piece up to the lantern, squinting at the barely visible shapes of the letters. It was enough to know that the men who had worked here had marked their goods, tracked them, perhaps even branded their trade. Michael stood still, absorbing the scene. Every object, every scar on the stone, told a story of survival and defiance. These were not mere fishermen, but men who had chosen to live in the margins, carving a livelihood from risk and secrecy. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, admiration for their resilience, unease at their lawlessness, and a strange kinship. For had he and Thomas not also stepped outside the safe paths of life by coming here? They had bought the island to escape the city's monotony, yet already they had been pulled into a legacy of men who had lived apart from the world on their own terms. Thomas's enthusiasm knew no bounds. He spoke of the cove as though it were a treasure in itself, a marvel hidden beneath the island that could transform their purchase from folly into fortune. He imagined telling their story, showing others the place, perhaps restoring parts of it to attract historians or travelers. His words tumbled rapidly, each vision brighter than the last. Michael listened, but his gaze lingered on the collapsed boats and rusted chains. To him, the cove was less an opportunity than a warning, a reminder of how easily men's ambitions could be swallowed by time. They remained in the cove until the lantern's flame began to sputter, its light shrinking back from the cavern walls. Reluctantly, they retraced their steps through the narrow passage, emerging once more into the first chamber of the cave. There, surrounded by crates and chests, they paused, the silence between them heavy with the weight of what they had seen. Above, the world continued indifferent, the waves striking the cliffs with tireless rhythm. But beneath the island, they had uncovered a harbor of shadows, a place where men had built a secret life that endured even in ruin. When they climbed the stair and lifted the stone slab once more, the late afternoon light spilled into the hut, startling in its brightness after the gloom below. The sea outside glittered with a harsh brilliance, the gulls wheeling and crying as though mocking their return. They stepped into the open air, blinking against the sun, and carried with them the memory of the cove, its hidden water and relics of a vanished trade. That evening they sat again by the stove, the chest of papers close at hand, the smell of salt and damp clinging to their clothes. The firelight flickered across their faces, painting them with shadows. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes alight with plans and possibilities, while Michael sat back, his thoughts heavy with caution. They had come to the island seeking escape, but already it had drawn them into something deeper, a history written not only in maps and ledgers, but in stone, wood, and salt water. The cove had revealed itself, and with it the certainty that the island would not let them go easily. The days that followed their discovery of the hidden cove unfolded with a strange heaviness. The island, which had first seemed like a quiet refuge from the noise and soot of their former life, now carried the weight of secrets pressing up from the ground beneath them. The brothers went about their daily tasks of repairing the hut, fetching driftwood, and attempting to clear patches of tangled brush, but their thoughts were never far from the darkness that lay below. Each time they passed the slab in the floor, each time the sea breeze carried the faint scent of salt through the broken window, they felt the pull of the cave and the cove it concealed. Thomas, restless as ever, allowed the discovery to ignite his imagination. He could not pass a single evening without speaking of what they might do with what they had found. He saw the cave and the cove not as relics to be hidden away, but as opportunities waiting to be grasped. In his vision, the island could be transformed into something alive again, a place where visitors would come to marvel at the smugglers' hideout, where historians would pore over the ledgers and maps, and where tourists would pay to see the relics of a life long buried by the sea. He spoke of boats bringing curious travelers, of guides leading them down into the cavern, of money flowing steadily into their hands. Michael, by contrast, grew more guarded. Each time Thomas spoke of profit and attention, he felt his chest tighten with unease. To him, the island was not a stage for showmanship, but a graveyard of lives lived in shadow. The papers, the coins, the barrels and boats, these were not trinkets to be displayed, but fragments of history that demanded respect. He feared that to commercialize them would cheapen what they had uncovered, reducing the struggles and dangers of those men to nothing more than spectacle. At night he would read again through the brittle pages of the ledgers, tracing with his eyes the initials and numbers, and wonder what desperation had driven men to risk so much. The idea of turning their pain into profit seemed to him a betrayal. The difference in their perspectives began as little more than a tension in the air between them. Thomas would speak brightly, his hands moving as he painted his visions of the island's future, and Michael would listen in silence, his face unreadable. But soon silence gave way to argument. Michael would remind his brother of the importance of truth, of preserving history intact, of sharing the records with scholars who could piece together the full story. Thomas would counter with impatience, insisting that history was not only meant for scholars, but for people, for those who could be inspired or entertained, and that they had as much right as anyone to shape the narrative now that the island belonged to them. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the damp walls of the hut, their voices rose higher than before. Thomas paced the narrow room, his face flushed with frustration. He spoke of all the years they had wasted in the gray alleys of their town, breathing smoke, working endless shifts with nothing to show for it. Now at last, fate had placed something extraordinary in their hands. Was it not their right, he demanded, to use it, to profit from it, to carve out a better life than the one they had been dealt? Michael, seated by the chest of papers, stared at the flames as if seeking answers there. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. He told Thomas that some things were greater than profit, that the weight of history was not a tool to be used but a burden to be honored. Their argument lasted long into the night, circling around the same points until both were exhausted, their voices hoarse. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant crash of waves against the rocks. Yet even in silence, the division remained, sharper than ever. For the first time since they had left their old life behind, the brothers felt themselves standing on different shores. The following days did little to ease the strain. Thomas grew impatient with Michael's reluctance, muttering under his breath when his brother refused to discuss plans for tourism or profit. Michael withdrew further into himself, spending hours with the ledgers and maps, trying to piece together the smuggling routes, the meanings of the symbols, the patterns of trade. The more he read, the more he became convinced that the island held not only the remnants of crime, but also the stories of men caught in currents larger than themselves. To release the documents to the world, he argued to himself, would allow those stories to be told honestly, without distortion or greed. Yet Thomas would not be swayed. He began to sketch plans in the dirt outside the hut, tracing the outlines of paths for visitors, imagining platforms and railings to guide them into the cave. He spoke of building a small dock where boats could tie up, of advertising the island as a destination, of drawing in those who craved a glimpse into a forbidden past. When Michael confronted him about the recklessness of such ideas, Thomas shot back with anger, asking if his brother intended to spend the rest of their lives rotting on this island, hoarding old papers that no one would ever see. Their quarrels grew sharper, each word cutting deeper. Michael accused Thomas of greed, of caring nothing for the truth. Thomas accused Michael of cowardice, of hiding behind lofty ideals while opportunities slipped away. The bond that had held them together through childhood and hardship, the bond that had brought them to the island in the first place, now felt strained to the breaking point. And yet, beneath all the bitterness, there lingered an unspoken truth. Both of them cared deeply, though in different ways. Michael's reverence and Thomas's ambition were born from the same fire, the same need to make meaning of the life they had chosen. One evening, after another long day of silence and avoidance, Michael returned from gathering wood to find Thomas sitting by the fire, the chest of papers open before him. His brother's face was pale in the lamplight, his jaw set as he sifted through the bundles of documents. When Michael asked what he was doing, Thomas looked up with eyes that burned with determination. He said he was searching for proof that the island could be more than a relic, proof that their discovery could change their lives if only Michael would stop clinging to caution. Michael stepped forward and closed the chest with a firm hand, his voice trembling as he told Thomas that they were guardians, not owners, of what they had found. The clash that followed shook the hut. Thomas rose to his feet, his fists clenched, his voice hoarse with anger. He shouted that he was tired of living small, tired of letting chances slip away, because Michael was too afraid to take them. Michael, his face flushed, shouted back that Thomas's hunger would destroy them both, that chasing wealth and fame would reduce the island's history to nothing more than spectacle. The storm of words filled the small space until both stood trembling, their breath ragged, their eyes locked in fury and hurt. At last, silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. Thomas turned away, his shoulders heaving, and walked out into the night. Michael remained by the fire, staring into the flames until they blurred before his eyes. The sound of the sea filled the darkness outside, relentless and indifferent. The conflict between them had no easy resolution. It seeped into every moment, shaping their thoughts, their movements, their silences. Yet even as anger and resentment smoldered, neither could bring themselves to abandon the island or the discovery. For beneath all their quarrels lay the same unspoken truth. The island had changed them, bound them to a story larger than either had imagined. And though they could not agree on how to face it, both knew they would be unable to turn away. In the days that followed, they worked side by side with less conversation, their movements stiff and mechanical. Michael continued to study the documents, piecing together the fragments of trade and secrecy, while Thomas sketched his visions of profit in the dirt and in the margins of stray papers. The fire between them had not cooled, but for now it lay banked, waiting. Above them, the sea wind carried the smell of salt and the cries of gulls, as if reminding them that the island itself remained patient, watching, holding its secrets close until the brothers decided their course. The discovery of the cove had revealed not only the depth of history beneath the island, but also the depth of division between the brothers. Their bond, once seamless, now bore the cracks of ambition and caution, of greed and reverence. And though they stood side by side, repairing their hut and gathering wood, their minds already walked separate paths that would soon demand a choice neither could escape. The tension between the brothers did not dissolve with time. It thickened like the sea fog that sometimes rolled in from the horizon, wrapping the island in a damp silence. Days passed where neither spoke much beyond what was necessary, each absorbed in his own vision of the future, but the air between them vibrated with unspoken arguments. Michael continued to pore over the bundles of papers they had recovered, spreading them across the rickety table in the hut, tracing the faded ink with his fingers, as though by doing so he could conjure the lives of those who had written them. Thomas drifted restlessly from one task to another, repairing parts of the roof with impatient movements, hauling wood for the stove, then abandoning it halfway through, his thoughts drawn inevitably back to the cavern below. It was during one of these long afternoons that Michael made the discovery which would alter the course of their quarrel. The light outside had dimmed beneath a layer of cloud, and the hut seemed smaller than usual, the smell of damp wood heavy in the air. Michael sat bent over the chest, his eyes tired, when he noticed a bundle of papers wedged against the bottom, its edges darker with age than the rest. The string around it had nearly disintegrated, crumbling under his touch, and when he drew the bundle free, a dust of centuries scattered across the floor. He laid the fragile sheets out carefully, his heart quickening as he saw that these were not ledgers of crates or lists of cargo. The handwriting was more deliberate, more ornate, and the language more formal. Thomas entered just as Michael was adjusting the lantern to better see, his brother's eyes, quick to catch the flicker of intensity in Michael's expression, narrowed with curiosity. Without waiting for invitation, he stepped closer and leaned over the table. Together they read the first page, the ink faded but still legible enough to carry meaning. It was a letter, written in careful hand, addressed not to a smuggler or sailor, but to a man of standing. The words spoke of agreements, of shipments protected by certain hands, and of assurances that silence would be maintained in exchange for wealth. The names, though blurred by time, were not unfamiliar. Michael felt his stomach twist as he sounded them out, realizing that they belonged to families whose descendants still lived, many of them with reputations of high regard and wealth on the mainland. They turned the pages with increasing urgency, each sheet unveiling more of the same. Correspondence, agreements, even signatures where the ink had bled deep into the paper. It became clear that the smuggling enterprise had not been the work of desperate men alone. It had been facilitated, protected, and financed by people whose names carried weight in society, people who had built their families' fortunes on foundations much darker than the stories told in polite company. Thomas's face lit with a fierce gleam as he read. Here, he declared, was the proof he had wanted. These documents were not just relics of old crimes. They were weapons, capable of shaking reputations and altering fortunes. With them, they could demand recognition, even payment. If the descendants of those names wished to keep their past buried, surely they would offer something in exchange for silence. His voice carried excitement, almost triumph, as though the conflict between them had already been resolved in his favor. Michael, however, felt only dread. He could not shake the sense that they were holding something far more dangerous than gold or coins. These papers were not inert relics, but living threats, capable of destroying lives and igniting consequences neither of them could predict. He thought of the men and women who now bore those names, many perhaps ignorant of the stains on their family's history, and of the powerful few who might already know and go to great lengths to ensure it remained hidden. His voice shook as he warned Thomas that they had stumbled into a realm far beyond their depth, a place where greed could bring ruin, not only upon others but upon themselves. But Thomas was deaf to caution. He spoke rapidly of possibilities of selling the documents quietly to collectors of rare papers, or of leaking them to journalists who would pay handsomely for such a scandal. He imagined the stir it would cause, the headlines, the notoriety, the fortune. Michael countered with the idea of handing the papers over to historians, preserving them in archives where truth could be studied without exploitation. Their argument reignited with the same heat as before, but now it burned with sharper edges, for the documents had given their quarrel new fuel. The nights grew long as they wrestled with the implications. The sea's endless voice outside seemed to mock their indecision, the waves crashing as though in laughter at the folly of men who believed they could command the weight of history. Thomas would pace the floor, the bundle of papers in his hands, speaking of leverage and opportunity. Michael would sit rigid, his hands clenched, insisting that such leverage could easily turn to a noose around their necks. Each word drove them further apart, and yet neither could bring himself to let go of the bundle that now lay at the center of their table like a coiled serpent. One evening, as the wind rose and rattled the shutters, Michael confronted his brother more directly than ever before. He told Thomas that to use the documents for profit would be to step into the same shadows that had claimed the men who wrote them, that they would become no better than smugglers themselves, bartering truth for gain. Thomas's laughter was sharp, edged with bitterness. He asked what good it was to worship truth if it left them penniless, stranded on an island with nothing but rotting planks and memories of other men's crimes. The words cut deep, leaving Michael silent and heavy with grief. Yet even Thomas, in his excitement, felt a tremor of unease as the days wore on. At night he lay awake, the bundle of papers close at hand, and wondered whether the names inscribed there might still wield power in unseen ways. If word of their discovery spread, if someone learned what they held, what might be the consequence? Would men come quietly to retrieve the past, or would they arrive with violence, determined to erase all trace of it? The thought lingered in his mind, unspoken, but it haunted him even as he tried to suppress it. The island itself seemed to echo their turmoil. The wind pressed more insistently through the gaps in the hut, carrying the sound of the waves like a drumbeat. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries harsh and grating, as though they too demanded an answer. The brothers moved about their task with a stiffness that betrayed their inner conflict. They worked side by side but no longer together, each lost in his own vision of what must come. The fragile bundle of documents remained between them, a constant reminder that the ground beneath their feet carried more than earth and stone. It carried the weight of choices that could not be undone. It was clear to them both, though neither admitted it aloud, that they had reached a precipice. The ledgers and maps had revealed a hidden past. The cove had shown them the scope of human ambition. But these documents reached into the present, tying the shadows of history to names that still lived, still commanded respect and authority. The path forward was no longer a question of curiosity or discovery. It was a matter of survival, of responsibility, and of conscience. Michael prayed in his quiet way that his brother would see reason, that the hunger for gain would give way to the humility of truth. Thomas prayed for nothing, but his restless heart beat faster with every thought of the power those papers might bring. Between them, the bundle of documents lay waiting, its fragile pages holding a storm that neither brother could yet name, but both knew was coming. And so the island kept its silence, the waves striking the rocks as they had for centuries, indifferent to the struggles of the men who walked its soil. But within the walls of the hut, the silence between two brothers grew louder than the sea, filled with the weight of dangerous words written long ago. Words that now demanded a choice as unyielding as the stone that hid the cove. The days after the discovery of the incriminating papers pressed down on the brothers with a heaviness that seemed to seep into every corner of their lives on the island. They could not escape the presence of the fragile bundle lying inside the chest, nor could they escape the knowledge that those thin pages held more power than either of them had ever imagined. The ledgers and maps had been fascinating, the cove had been astonishing, but the letters and agreements were something else entirely. They tied the shadows of the past to the present, binding men who still lived, whose families still thrived, to the crimes of a bygone age. The very knowledge of it had changed the rhythm of their days. They rose each morning with the salt wind in their faces and the cry of gulls overhead, but their thoughts never strayed far from what lay hidden in the chest. Michael spent hours sitting quietly by the table, reading and rereading the papers until the words blurred before his eyes, trying to convince himself that truth, however dangerous, must be preserved. Thomas, restless and consumed by dreams of power, paced the hut or wandered the shoreline, his mind leaping ahead to what might be gained if only they were bold enough to act. The island that had once seemed to offer a kind of peace now felt like a crucible, testing them, pressing them toward decisions they could not delay forever. Their arguments, once loud and fiery, settled into a colder rhythm. Instead of shouting, they spoke with clipped voices, each word heavy with conviction. Michael insisted that the documents should be given to historians, entrusted to people who could preserve them for study, where truth would serve posterity rather than greed. He spoke of responsibility, of their duty to honor what had been hidden so carefully, not to exploit it for their own ends. Thomas countered that no one else had bled for this discovery, no one else had lifted stones or braved the damp air of the cave. The island belonged to them, and so did everything on it. To hand it over would be an act of cowardice, a surrender of their only chance to escape the long shadow of mediocrity that had defined their lives until now. The conflict grew not only in words, but in their very way of moving through the days. Michael walked the island with a deliberate calm, pausing to study the cliffs, the soil, the fragile remnants of what had once been a fisherman's hut. He seemed to look at everything as though it were a fragment of history, something to be understood and preserved. Thomas moved quickly, impatiently, his eyes darting, his hands restless, already reshaping the island in his mind into docks and walkways, into paths where tourists would tread and voices would echo. They lived side by side, but it was as if they inhabited two different islands. One night, as the wind rose and the sea roared against the rocks, the storm between them broke open again. The papers lay spread across the table, flickering in the lamplight. Michael stood with his hands pressed flat against the wood, his head bowed, his voice low but steady as he declared that he could not and would not be part of any scheme to sell or exploit the documents. To do so, he said, would be to place themselves in the same shadows as the men who had carved their lives from secrecy and fear. He spoke of Jonathan Grayson and the other nameless men whose hands had built the cove and filled the crates, of the cost they had paid, and of the lesson that history demanded. Thomas, standing opposite him, his fists clenched and his face flushed, accused him of self-righteousness, of preferring ideals to life itself. He shouted that Michael was content to rot in poverty while treasure lay in his grasp, and that such cowardice was worse than any crime. The fight ended in silence. Neither yielded. Neither could. They turned from each other, and the hut filled with the sound of the storm outside, the waves battering the cliffs, the timbers creaking under the wind. Yet even in the silence, a decision was forming in each of their hearts. Morning brought a kind of clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the island washed clean and bright. The sea glittered under the rising sun, and the air carried a sharp freshness that seemed to demand resolution. The brothers rose without speaking, but each knew that the moment could no longer be delayed. The documents could not remain in the chest forever. They had to choose. It was Michael who spoke first. His voice was calm, though inside his heart pounded with the weight of the moment. He said that the truth must be given away, that they should carry the documents back to the mainland, to a library or museum, where they would be preserved and studied. He admitted that such a choice might bring no profit, that it might even bring danger, but he insisted that it was the only path that honored the weight of what they had found. Thomas listened, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. When he answered, his voice trembled with frustration and longing. He said that he could not believe they had come so far, worked so hard, only to hand everything over to strangers who would thank them with nothing more than a line in a book. The silence stretched between them until it seemed the sea itself paused in its crashing. Then Thomas turned away, stepping out of the hut into the bright morning. He walked down to the cove, his boots crunching on gravel, his breath quick and sharp. He stood at the edge of the hidden harbor, looking at the remnants of the boats, the rusted chains, the posts leaning toward the water. He imagined them whole again, alive with men in movement, alive with profit and risk. His heart swelled with the thrill of what might be. Yet even as it did, he felt the weight of his brother's words pressing on him. Michael followed slowly, carrying the chest of papers. When he reached his brother, they stood together in silence, staring out at the secret cove that had revealed so much and demanded so much more. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries harsh against the stillness. At last Thomas turned, his eyes filled not with anger now, but with something heavier, more uncertain. He said that perhaps Michael was right, that perhaps some things were too heavy to be carried for oneself. The words came reluctantly, but they came. The choice was made quietly, without further quarrel. They would not sell, they would not exploit. They would not trade the weight of history for coins. Together they carried the chest back to the hut, and in the days that followed they prepared to return to the mainland. Each evening, as the sun sank and the island grew quiet, they sat by the fire and spoke not of profit or loss, but of legacy, of what it meant to live honestly in the face of temptation. When at last they left the island, the sea calm beneath their boat, they carried not only the chest of papers, but also the burden and the peace of their decision. The island remained behind them, silent and watchful, its secrets once more hidden in stone and salt. But in their hearts, the brothers carried the knowledge that they had chosen not wealth, but truth, not spectacle, but honor. And though the path ahead was uncertain, they felt a quiet strength in knowing that they had preserved something greater than themselves. The sea stretched wide around them, endless and indifferent, but for the first time since setting foot on the island, the brothers felt as though they were moving toward a horizon they could face together. The choice had cost them much, the dream of easy fortune, the thrill of power, but it had given them something deeper, something enduring. They had learned that true inheritance lay not in gold or coins, or even in secrets uncovered, but in the decisions one made when faced with them. And so, with the salt wind in their faces and the chest of dangerous documents at their feet, they left the island behind, not as men defeated by temptation, but as men who had chosen to carry the weight of history with dignity. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next shocking discovery. Turn on notifications and be the first to uncover the secrets we reveal. Don't stop here. Watch the next video on your screen right now. It's even more unbelievable than this one. And share this video with your friends and family. Trust me, they won't believe what happens next until they see it with their own eyes.